At 24, Amara Johnson believed that movement could heal anything, that music could reach the unreachable, and that every child deserved someone who understood their silent language. She worked as a dance movement therapist at the Riverside Community Center while completing her master's degree in special education, pouring her heart into children others had given up on. But when mounting debt and an eviction notice threatened to destroy everything she had built, one simple request to dance would change her life forever. The late afternoon sun filtered through the scratched windows of the community center's main room, casting long shadows across the scuffed wooden floor where Amara knelt beside 7-year-old Marcus. Not her brother, but a child whose autism made the world too loud, too bright, too overwhelming. Her voice was soft, melodic, the kind of tone that seemed to wrap around frightened hearts and convince them they were safe. "Let's try moving like water today," she suggested, her hands demonstrating the gentle, flowing motions she hoped would help him process the overwhelming emotions that had triggered his meltdown 20 minutes earlier. Marcus sat rigid in the corner, his small hands pressed tight over his ears, his body rocking in the repetitive motion that brought him comfort when everything else felt like chaos. At 24, Amara had learned to read the subtle language of children who communicated in movement rather than words, who found safety in rhythm when verbal reassurance failed them. Her natural hair was pulled back in a protective style that kept it neat through long days of dancing, crawling on floors, and moving with children who needed someone to meet them in their world rather than forcing them into everyone else's. She was beautiful in an understated way, with warm brown eyes that held infinite patience and a smile that could convince the most withdrawn child to take her hand. Her movements were graceful even when she was exhausted, which was most of the time these days. The grace came naturally, a product of years of dance training before life had steered her toward helping others instead of performing. Behind her calm exterior, though, Amara was drowning. The student loan statements that arrived each month showed a balance that had somehow grown to $45,000 despite her making payments she could barely afford. Her graduate program demanded full-time commitment, but full-time commitment didn't pay the bills, so she worked at the community center 3 days a week, tutored kids in the evenings, and spent weekends teaching dance classes at a studio across town. Her apartment, a small one-bedroom in a building where the heat worked sporadically and the elevator had been broken for 6 months, cost $800 a month that she often had to choose between paying and buying groceries. This month, she hadn't been able to choose at all. The eviction notice taped to her door 3 days ago gave her until the end of the month to come up with $3,000. 2 months back rent plus late fees that seemed to multiply every time she looked at the paper. The worst part wasn't her own struggle, though. The worst part was 19-year-old Marcus Johnson, her actual brother, not the child she was working with now, who was a sophomore at the state university studying engineering. Marcus, who had been her responsibility since their parents died in a car accident when he was 15 and she was 20. Marcus, who believed his sister had everything under control, who called her every Sunday to tell her about his classes and his friends and his bright future, never knowing that his tuition payments were the reason she hadn't eaten anything but ramen noodles in 2 weeks. "Here, Marcus," Amara said gently to the boy in front of her, switching her attention back to him with the practiced ease of someone who had learned to compartmentalize her own problems when children needed her. She began moving her arms in slow, wave-like motions, her whole body becoming part of the demonstration. "The water moves like this, smooth and easy. It doesn't fight anything. It just flows around whatever gets in its way." The boy's rocking slowed slightly, his eyes flickering toward her movements though his hands remained pressed over his ears. Amara had been working with him for 3 months, ever since his mother brought him to the center in tears, explaining that he hadn't spoken in weeks and his regular therapist didn't know what else to try. "That's it," she whispered as Marcus began to mirror her arm movements, his small body still tense, but starting to engage with the rhythm she was creating. "You're doing so well. The water doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to move." This was why she did this work, despite the impossible schedule and the constant financial pressure that felt like a weight on her chest. This moment, when a child who had been lost in their own overwhelming world suddenly found a bridge back to connection, made every struggle feel worth it. Marcus was starting to breathe more slowly, his movements becoming more fluid as he followed her lead. "That's where your mom said we might find you." A voice interrupted from the doorway, though it was gentle enough not to startle the boy they were working with. Amara looked up to see David Kim, the center's director, a kind man in his 50s who had hired her despite her lack of formal certification because he believed in her natural ability to reach difficult cases. Behind him stood a woman she didn't recognize, well-dressed and nervous-looking. "This is Mrs. Chun," David continued, his voice still soft out of respect for the session in progress. "She heard about your work with nonverbal children and was hoping to speak with you." Amara glanced down at Marcus, who had stopped moving and was watching the adults with the wariness that came naturally to children who found social interaction unpredictable. She reached over and gently touched his shoulder, a gesture he had learned to accept from her, though he still flinched when most people tried to make contact. "We're going to pause our water dance for today, Marcus," she told him, her voice maintaining the calm tone that had become second nature. "Your mom will be here soon, and you can show her how water moves if you want to." The boy nodded, a small movement that represented enormous progress from the child who had arrived at the center unable to acknowledge other people's presence. Amara stood slowly, brushing the dust from her jeans and giving him one last encouraging smile before turning her attention to the woman David had brought. Mrs. Chun was clearly wealthy, evident in the designer handbag she carried and the way her clothes fit with the precision that came from expensive tailoring. She looked like she had been crying recently, though she was trying to hide it, and her hands twisted together in a gesture Amara recognized from dozens of parents who had brought their children here as a last resort. "Ms. Johnson," Mrs. Chun began, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I've heard that you work with autistic children, that you can reach kids when other people can't. My son, he's 8, and he's been struggling so much lately. He won't speak to anyone, won't let anyone touch him, and his father and I, we don't know what to do anymore." Amara felt the familiar tug of empathy that drew her to this work, the instinctive need to help a child who was lost in a world that didn't understand them. At the same time, though, she couldn't ignore the practical reality that was never far from her thoughts these days. The community center paid her $12 an hour for the 3 days a week she worked here. Private sessions, if she could get them, paid $50 an hour, but she had to be careful about taking on too much outside work while she was still in graduate school. "I'd be happy to talk with you about your son," she said carefully. "Let me just finish up here, and then we can sit down and discuss what might help him." Mrs. Chin's face showed relief so profound that Amara felt guilty for her moment of hesitation. This was a mother desperate to help her child, and money or no money, Amara couldn't turn away from that need. It was what had gotten her into this field in the first place, the knowledge that there were children who needed someone to see them, really see them, not just their diagnosis or their limitations. As David led Mrs. Chun to his office to wait, Amara turned back to Marcus, who had resumed his gentle rocking but was watching her with more awareness than he had shown when the session began. She knelt down again, bringing herself to his eye level. "You did such good work today," she told him sincerely. "The water dance helped you feel better, didn't it?" He nodded again, and this time he looked directly at her face for a moment before glancing away. For Marcus, that level of eye contact represented a major breakthrough, and Amara felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came from knowing she had helped a child take another step toward connection with the world around him. His mother arrived a few minutes later, a tired-looking woman who worked 2 jobs to support her son's therapy needs. Amara gave her a brief report on the session's progress, mentioning the eye contact and the way Marcus had begun to self-soothe through movement rather than needing to completely shut down when overwhelmed. "He's making real progress," she assured the mother, who looked as exhausted as Amara felt most days. "The movement therapy is giving him tools to regulate his emotions, and that's going to help him in every other area of his life." "Thank you," the mother said, her gratitude evident in her voice. "I don't know what we would do without you in this place. Marcus looks forward to coming here all week." As they left, Amara gathered her things and tried to calculate in her head whether taking on another private client would be manageable with her current schedule. She was already working 6 days a week between the community center, her tutoring sessions, and the dance classes, but $3,000 might as well be $3 million given her current situation. The eviction notice was folded in her backpack, a constant reminder that time was running out. She had considered dropping out of graduate school, but that would mean defaulting on her student loans and giving up on the career that she had worked so hard to build. She had considered asking Marcus to take a semester off from college, but the thought of derailing his future because of her financial mistakes made her feel sick. Walking toward David's office where Mrs. Chun was waiting, Amara tried to push down the anxiety that had become her constant companion. Whatever this woman needed, whatever her son was struggling with, Amara would find a way to help. That was what she did, what she had always done, even when she didn't know how she was going to help herself. The black Bentley that pulled up outside the Riverside Community Center looked as out of place as a diamond in a coal mine, its pristine surface reflecting the late afternoon sun, while the building behind it showed every one of its 40 years through cracked concrete and peeling paint. From the driver's seat emerged a man who moved with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to command, his expensive charcoal suit tailored perfectly to his lean frame, his dark hair styled with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of wealth and power. Kim Tae-young was 36 years old and controlled more territory than most people could imagine, his legitimate businesses in luxury real estate and private security serving as the visible face of an empire built on respect, fear, and absolute loyalty. He was Korean, though he had been born and raised in this city, and he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had never learned to doubt his own authority. His sharp features were arranged in an expression of controlled calm that revealed nothing of what he was thinking, dark eyes that missed no detail and gave away even less. Everything about him suggested wealth and danger in equal measure, from the Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent to the subtle bulge beneath his jacket that indicated he was never truly unarmed. When he moved, people noticed, and when he spoke, people listened, because Kim Tae-young was not the kind of man who repeated himself. But today, stepping out of his car and looking up at the community center's faded sign, he looked like what he rarely allowed himself to be, a father who had run out of options. From the back seat, he carefully helped a small boy emerge, 8-year-old Kim Ji-ho, who shared his father's dark hair and delicate features, but none of his commanding presence. Ji-ho kept his eyes focused on the ground, his small hands pressed against his ears, his body rigid with the tension that came from being overwhelmed by a world that felt too loud, too bright, too demanding. The boy was beautiful in the way children often are, with long eyelashes and a sweet face that should have been animated with curiosity and joy. Instead, Ji-ho moved through the world like he was walking through a minefield, every step calculated to avoid triggers that might send him into the kind of meltdown that left both father and son exhausted and heartbroken. Tae-young had been bringing Ji-ho to specialists for 3 years, ever since the autism diagnosis had finally given them a name for the challenges his son faced. Speech therapists, occupational therapists, behavioral specialists, each one promising progress that came slowly if it came at all. Some days, Tae-young wondered if his son would ever look him in the eye, ever reach for his hand, ever say the words "I love you" that Tae-young spoke to him every night before bed. The boy's mother had died during childbirth, leaving Tae-young to navigate single parenthood while running an organization that demanded his attention around the clock. He had hired the best nannies, enrolled Ji-ho in the most prestigious schools, consulted with doctors whose fees could have bought luxury cars, but none of it seemed to reach the child who remained locked in his own private world. Dr. Martinez, Ji-ho's developmental pediatrician, had mentioned this community center almost reluctantly, explaining that sometimes unconventional approaches succeeded where traditional therapy failed. She had heard about a young woman who worked with autistic children through movement and music, achieving breakthroughs that surprised everyone involved. Tae-young had been skeptical, but desperation had a way of making skeptics willing to try anything. The same week that Ji-ho had had 3 separate meltdowns at his expensive private school, culminating in a teacher suggesting that perhaps he needed a more specialized environment, Tae-young had called the community center and made an appointment. Now, standing outside the building that looked like it belonged to a different world than the one he usually inhabited, he wondered if this was simply another dead and dressed up as hope. The contrast between his Bentley and the rusty cars parked nearby felt symbolic of how far he had traveled from his usual environment in search of help for his son. "Ji-ho, come with Daddy," Tae-young said softly, his voice gentler than anyone in his professional life had ever heard it. "We're going to meet someone who might be able to help you feel better." The boy didn't respond, continuing to press his hands over his ears and rock slightly from foot to foot, a self-soothing behavior that Taeyong had learned not to interrupt. Instead, he simply placed a protective hand on Jiho's shoulder and guided him toward the entrance, moving slowly to give the child time to process each new stimulus. Inside, the community center smelled like floor wax and children's activities, a mixture of art supplies and gymnasium equipment that reminded Taeyong of his own childhood before life had become complicated by power and responsibility. The woman at the front desk looked up with the kind of practiced smile that suggested she was used to dealing with parents in crisis. "You must be Mr. Kim," she said warmly. "David is expecting you. He'll take you back to meet Amara." David Kim turned out to be a man in his 50s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades working with children and families facing challenges. He greeted Taeyong with a respectful handshake and Jiho with gentle words that the boy ignored completely, his attention focused on the patterns in the linoleum floor. "Amara is finishing up with another client, but she should be available in just a few minutes," David explained as he led them down a hallway lined with children's artwork. "She's remarkable with kids who struggle to connect. There's something about the way she approaches them, like she speaks their language." They paused outside a room with large windows that allowed them to see inside, where a young black woman was working with a boy who appeared to be around Jiho's age. The child was sitting on the floor, rocking back and forth in a way that Taeyong recognized immediately, while the woman knelt beside him, moving her arms in slow, rhythmic motions. "That's Amara Johnson," David said quietly. "She's our dance movement therapist." Taeyong watched through the window as the woman continued her gentle movements, her voice too soft to hear through the glass, but her manner radiating the kind of patience that couldn't be taught or faked. There was something about her presence that seemed to calm the space around her, a quality of stillness that Taeyong found himself drawn to despite his natural skepticism about new people. She was beautiful, he noticed, but in an understated way that spoke to character rather than artifice. Her natural hair was pulled back practically but elegantly, and she moved with a grace that suggested years of dance training. More importantly, the child she was working with had stopped rocking and was beginning to mirror her movements, his face showing the first signs of engagement Taeyong had seen. After a few minutes, the session inside concluded, and David led them into the room where Amara was cleaning up exercise mats and putting away small percussion instruments. When she looked up and saw them, her smile was immediate and genuine, the kind of warmth that made even Taeyong's carefully guarded expression soften slightly. "You must be Jiho," she said, directing her attention to the boy rather than the imposing man in the expensive suit. "I'm Amara. I've been looking forward to meeting you." Jiho didn't look up, continuing to stare at the floor while his hands remained pressed over his ears, but Amara seemed completely unfazed by his lack of response. Instead, she moved to where a small speaker sat on a shelf and turned on soft instrumental music, the kind of gentle melody that filled space without demanding attention. "I was just about to practice some dancing," she said conversationally, as if she were speaking to any child rather than one who appeared to be completely unaware of her presence. "Dancing helps me think better, and I have some important thinking to do today." She began to move, not in a performance way, but with the natural rhythm of someone who found joy in movement. Her steps were simple, flowing motions that seemed to follow the music's gentle pulse, and gradually Taeyong noticed that Jiho's rocking had begun to match the tempo of her dance. "You know what?" she said after a moment, turning toward Jiho with no expectation in her voice, no pressure for him to respond. "I think this song would be even better with a partner. Would you like to have one dance with me?" It was such a simple request, delivered with such casual acceptance of whatever answer he might give, that Taeyong almost didn't register the magnitude of what happened next. Jiho, who had never made eye contact with a stranger, who flinched away from unfamiliar touch, who seemed to live in a world where other people were simply part of the overwhelming background noise, slowly lifted his head and looked directly at Amara's face. For a moment, neither of them moved, and Taeyong felt his breath catch in his throat as his son seemed to truly see another person for the first time in his memory. Then, incredibly, Jiho took his hands away from his ears and reached one small hand toward Amara's outstretched fingers. The moment their hands touched, something shifted in the room's energy. Jiho didn't pull away or tense up as he did with virtually every other form of human contact. Instead, he allowed Amara to guide him into the gentle, swaying motion of her dance, his movements tentative at first, but gradually becoming more confident as he followed her lead. Taeyong watched in stunned silence as his son, the boy who had never willingly held anyone's hand, who had never joined in group activities, who had never shown interest in music or movement, began to dance. It wasn't elaborate or performative, just a simple swaying motion that matched the rhythm of the soft music. But to Taeyong it looked like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Amara was careful not to make any sudden movements or demands, allowing Jiho to lead the interaction while providing gentle guidance. She hummed along with the music, a soft melodic sound that seemed to wrap around both of them, and Taeyong could see his son's face beginning to relax in a way he had rarely witnessed. "You're a natural dancer," Amara told Jiho quietly, her voice full of genuine admiration. "I can tell you feel the music the same way I do." When the song ended, Jiho didn't immediately pull away. Instead, he stood there holding her hand, looking up at her face with an expression of wonder that made Taeyong's chest tight with emotion he didn't know how to process. His son, who had seemed unreachable for so many years, had just connected with a stranger in a way that felt nothing short of miraculous. "Thank you for that dance," Amara said to Jiho, her tone treating the interaction with the same respect she would have given to any dance partner. "That was one of the best dances I've had all week." Only then did Jiho gently release her hand and return to his father's side. But the change in his demeanor was unmistakable. He wasn't pressing his hands over his ears anymore, and while he wasn't making eye contact with Taeyong, he seemed calmer than he had been in weeks. Taeyong looked at Amara with an expression that held disbelief and something deeper, a recognition that this woman possessed something his money couldn't buy and his power couldn't command. The ability to reach his son in a way that no one else had ever managed. In his world, results were everything, and what he had just witnessed was a result that changed everything. 3 weeks after that first dance, Amara had become an essential part of Jiho's world in ways that surprised everyone, most of all herself. Taeyong had hired her for private sessions at $500 per hour, a rate that had made her stomach flutter with relief even as she tried to maintain professional composure. 4 sessions a week meant $2,000, enough to cover her rent and start chipping away at the mountain of debt that had been crushing her for months. The work itself was unlike anything she had experienced in her training. Jiho responded to movement in ways that traditional therapy had never achieved, his carefully guarded world opening incrementally each time they danced together. He had begun to vocalize during their sessions, not words exactly, but musical sounds that seemed to express emotions he couldn't articulate any other way. Today's session was taking place in the estate's music room, a space that Taeyong had converted specifically for Jiho's therapy needs. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked manicured gardens, and the hardwood floors were perfect for dancing. But the room's most remarkable feature was the grand piano that sat in one corner like a sleeping giant. Amara had discovered that Jiho was drawn to the piano's deep, resonant tones, though he had never attempted to play it. Instead, he would stand beside it during their sessions, one small hand resting on its polished surface while they moved through their exercises, as if he were absorbing the instrument's potential energy. "That's beautiful, Jiho," Amara said as the boy hummed along with the soft music playing from the room's sound system. "Your voice is like another instrument in our band." She had been working with him for 40 minutes, and his improvement was visible in everything from his posture to his willingness to make eye contact. Today, he had even initiated contact, reaching for her hand when he wanted to change the direction of their movement, a breakthrough that filled her with quiet pride. From the doorway, Taeyong watched the session with the focused attention he usually reserved for business negotiations. He attended every appointment, initially claiming it was to ensure Jiho's safety, but Amara suspected it was because he was as amazed by his son's progress as she was. The transformation in both father and son had been remarkable to witness. Taeyong, who had seemed so controlled and distant during their first meeting, had begun asking questions about how to incorporate movement into Jiho's daily routines. She had taught him simple exercises they could do together, ways to use rhythm and gentle motion to help Jiho transition between activities or calm down when the world became overwhelming. "Can you show Daddy our new stretching dance?" she asked Jiho, who nodded enthusiastically and moved toward his father with more confidence than Amara had ever seen him display. The stretching dance was a series of slow, flowing movements designed to help Jiho regulate his sensory input while building body awareness. As she guided both father and son through the sequence, Amara noticed how Taeyong's intense demeanor softened when he was focused on his child, his expensive suit forgotten as he knelt on the floor to match Jiho's movements. "Like this, Daddy," Jiho said clearly, the words emerging with startling clarity as he demonstrated a gentle twisting motion. Amara felt her breath catch. In 3 weeks of sessions, Jiho had never spoken directly to his father, had never initiated verbal communication with anyone except her, and even then it had been limited to simple responses. But now he was not only speaking but teaching, taking pride in sharing something he had learned. Taeyong's expression was carefully controlled, but Amara could see the emotion he was working to contain. "Very good, son," he said quietly. "Show me again." The session continued for another 20 minutes, with Jiho growing more animated and verbal as he demonstrated various movements and exercises. By the time they finished, he was glowing with accomplishment, his usual anxiety replaced by the kind of confidence that came from feeling truly seen and understood. As Amara packed her materials, Jiho surprised her by wrapping his arms around her waist in a spontaneous hug. The gesture was brief but genuine, and when he pulled away, he was smiling with the kind of pure joy that made all the challenges of her life seem worthwhile. "Thank you for dancing with me, Amara," he said solemnly, as if their sessions were formal occasions that required proper gratitude. "Thank you for dancing with me," she replied with equal seriousness. "You're teaching me new steps every time we practice together." After Jiho left with his nanny for his afternoon snack, Taeyong lingered in the music room, his attention focused on Amara with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how alone they were. He had been unfailingly professional during their interactions, but there was something different in his manner today, a recognition that went beyond simple appreciation for her work with his son. "What you've done for him," he began, then stopped, as if the words he wanted to say were harder to find than usual. "In 3 weeks, you've given him more progress than 3 years of other therapy. I need you to know how rare that is, how valuable." Amara felt heat rise in her cheeks at the sincerity in his voice. "Jiho is an amazing child," she said carefully. "He just needed someone to meet him where he was instead of trying to force him to be somewhere else. And you did that instinctively," Taeyong observed. "The first day, when you asked him to dance, you didn't try to change him or fix him. You just invited him to share something beautiful." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the front of the house, raised voices that made Taeyong's expression shift instantly from thoughtful to alert. Through the music room's windows, Amara could see a man arguing with the security guard at the estate's gate, his gestures aggressive and demanding. Her blood turned cold as she recognized Derek Morrison, 28 years old and convinced that the world owed him everything he wanted. They had dated for 6 months before she realized that his charm was a mask for a volatile temper and an inability to accept responsibility for his own failures. When she had ended their relationship 8 months ago, he had refused to accept her decision, alternating between pleading and threats in ways that had made her genuinely afraid. "Who is that?" Taeyong asked, his voice taking on a harder edge as he observed her obvious distress. "My ex-boyfriend," she said quietly, her hands trembling as she watched Derek become more agitated with the security guard. "He's been bothering me for months. I thought maybe he'd given up, but apparently not." Derek had somehow discovered where she worked, had probably followed her from the community center to figure out her new schedule. The thought of him knowing about this part of her life, about Jiho and the progress they had been making, filled her with a protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. Taeyong moved to the window, his trained eye taking in Derek's appearance and behavior with the kind of assessment that came from years of evaluating threats. Derek was average height, but built like someone who spent too much time at the gym trying to intimidate people with his physical presence. His clothes were expensive but flashy, the kind of designer knockoffs that screamed insecurity rather than success. "He seems upset," Taeyong observed with deliberate understatement. "He thinks I owe him money." Amara explained, though the reality was more complicated than that. Derek had loaned her $1,500 during their relationship, money she had used for her brother's tuition when her own paycheck had fallen short. When she had tried to pay him back after their breakup, he had refused to take the money, claiming that it was a gift and that she was insulting him by trying to return it. Then, when she had finally stopped calling and texting him, when she had made it clear that their relationship was permanently over, he had changed his story. Suddenly, the money was a loan that she had never repaid, and her failure to return it was theft. He had been showing up at her apartment, her school, her work, demanding repayment and threatening to ruin her reputation if she didn't also agree to give their relationship another chance. What kind of money? Taeyong asked, his attention still focused on Derek's increasingly aggressive behavior at the gate. $1,500 that he gave me while we were dating, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He said it was a gift, but now he wants it back. With interest. And he wants me to move back in with him. The security guard at the gate was speaking into his radio, clearly asking for instructions on how to handle the situation. Derek's voice was getting louder, his gestures more threatening, and Amara could see that he was working himself into the kind of rage that had made their final months together a constant source of fear. Stay here, Taeyong said quietly, his tone carrying the kind of authority that discouraged argument. He left the music room with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to handling problems personally and permanently. Amara watched from the window as he approached the gate, his expensive suit and controlled demeanor creating a stark contrast to Derek's aggressive posturing. The conversation between them was too distant to hear, but Derek's body language shifted immediately when he realized he was no longer dealing with a security guard. Taeyong spoke quietly, his hands relaxed at his sides, but there was something in his posture that conveyed unmistakable danger. Derek's bravado seemed to evaporate as he found himself face to face with someone who radiated the kind of power that couldn't be faked or intimidated. After less than 5 minutes, Derek was walking back to his car with the quick, nervous steps of someone who had just realized he was out of his depth. He drove away without looking back, but Amara could see the anger in the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. When Taeyong returned to the music room, his expression had returned to its usual controlled calm, but there was something different in his eyes, a recognition that the peaceful world they had been building for Jiho had just been threatened by outside forces. He won't be bothering you here again, he said simply. What did you tell him? Amara asked, though part of her didn't want to know. That you were under my protection, and that any further harassment would be dealt with accordingly, Taeyong replied. He understood the message, but Amara knew Derek well enough to recognize that his retreat was tactical rather than permanent. He didn't handle rejection well, and being forced to back down in front of witnesses would only fuel his anger. The thought of him taking that frustration out on her brother, or showing up at the community center where vulnerable children might be caught in the crossfire, made her feel sick with worry. As if reading her thoughts, Taeyong continued, "This isn't over for him, is it?" "No," she said quietly. "He doesn't like being told no, and he really doesn't like being embarrassed. He'll find another way to get to me, somewhere you're not around to stop him." The weight of Derek's reappearance settled over her like a familiar blanket of anxiety, the constant vigilance she had been living with for months returning in full force. Just when her life had started to stabilize, when she had found work that fulfilled her and made enough money to solve her immediate problems, Derek was back to remind her that peace was a luxury she couldn't afford. Taeyong was watching her with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like he was seeing all the fears she was trying to hide. "We'll need to discuss this further," he said finally. "Your safety affects Jiho's well-being, and Jiho's well-being is my priority." The practical way he framed the issue should have felt impersonal, but instead Amara found herself grateful for his directness. In her experience, people either dismissed her concerns about Derek as overreaction or became so worried that they made the situation worse with their panic. Taeyong's calm assessment of the threat felt like the first realistic response she had received. As she gathered her things to leave, though, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Taeyong's protection would mean crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His world was one of power and control, where problems were solved through methods she probably didn't want to understand. Getting involved with that world, even peripherally, felt like stepping onto a path that led away from everything she had planned for her life. But watching Jiho hug his father goodbye, seeing the peace and happiness in both their faces, she knew that some decisions were made by circumstances rather than choice. Derek's reappearance had changed the equation, and pretending otherwise would only put everyone she cared about at risk. 2 days after Derek's appearance at the estate, Taeyong requested that Amara stay after Jiho's session to discuss what he called a business proposition. The formal tone of his invitation made her stomach flutter with nervous anticipation as she followed him from the music room to his private office, a space that radiated the same controlled power as the man who occupied it. The office was elegant in its restraint, with dark wood paneling, leather furniture that looked both expensive and comfortable, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Behind his desk hung a single piece of art, a Korean calligraphy scroll that she couldn't read but that seemed to anchor the room's atmosphere of quiet authority. Taeyong gestured for her to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, then moved to close the door with deliberate care before settling into his own chair. The gesture felt significant, creating a barrier between this conversation and the rest of the world, and Amara found herself gripping the chair's armrests more tightly than necessary. What happened yesterday with your ex-boyfriend has made me realize that we need to formalize our arrangement, he began, his voice carrying the same measured tone he might use for any business discussion. Jiho's progress with you has been remarkable, but that progress is threatened if your safety remains uncertain. Amara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure where this conversation was heading. The sessions with Jiho had become the highlight of her week, both professionally and financially, but she sensed that Taeyong was about to propose something that went far beyond their current arrangement. I want to offer you a position as Jiho's full-time dance movement therapist, he continued, his dark eyes holding hers with steady intensity. The position would require you to live here, on the estate, to be available for his needs around the clock. In exchange, I'm prepared to offer you $150,000 per year, plus complete coverage of your graduate school tuition and living expenses. The numbers hit her like a physical blow, so far beyond what she had imagined possible that she had trouble processing their reality. $150,000 was more than her parents had ever made in a single year, more than she had dreamed of earning until she was well established in her career. It was enough to pay off her student loans, enough to secure Marcus's education, enough to transform her life completely. But the requirement to live on the estate, to be available around the clock, suggested a level of commitment that went beyond simple employment. You're asking me to give up my independence, she said carefully, trying to understand the full scope of what he was proposing. I'm asking you to accept a position that would provide you with complete financial security while allowing you to do the work you're clearly passionate about, Taeyong replied. Your independence has brought you to a point where you're facing eviction and considering dropping out of graduate school. I'm offering you the resources to achieve your goals without those constraints. The blunt assessment of her situation stung because it was accurate. Her fierce independence had indeed led her to a place where she was drowning financially, where every decision was driven by desperation rather than choice. The eviction notice was still taped to her apartment door, a daily reminder that time was running out for conventional solutions to her problems. What about my brother? She asked. Marcus is in college, and he depends on me for support. I would provide an apartment for him as well, Taeyong said without hesitation. Near his university, fully furnished, with all expenses covered. He would want for nothing. The offer was almost too generous to believe, addressing every concern she might have raised before she could voice them. But generosity on this scale came with expectations, and she needed to understand exactly what those expectations entailed. What would you require from me in return? She asked. Besides the work with Jiho, absolute loyalty, he replied immediately. What happens in this house, what you observe about my business or my personal life, remains confidential. Jiho's well-being becomes your priority above all other considerations. And if threats like your ex-boyfriend arise, you trust me to handle them rather than trying to manage them yourself. The mention of Derek sent a chill through her, a reminder that her current situation was untenable in ways that went beyond financial stress. Yesterday's confrontation at the gate had been a warning, not a resolution, and she knew Derek well enough to predict that his next attempt would be more strategic and potentially more dangerous. What if I wanted to leave? She asked. What if the arrangement didn't work out? Then you would leave, Taeyong said simply. But the financial benefits would end immediately, and you would be responsible for your own security arrangements. The implication was clear. Accepting his offer meant accepting his protection, and rejecting his protection meant returning to a world where Derek's threats could materialize without interference. It wasn't exactly coercion, but it wasn't exactly choice either. Amara looked out the office windows at the city beyond, where her small apartment waited with its eviction notice, and her brother continued his studies without knowing how precarious their situation had become. The weight of responsibility that had been crushing her for years seemed to crystallize in this moment. The recognition that her independence was a luxury she could no longer afford. I need to think about this, she said finally. Of course, Taeyong replied, his expression revealing nothing of what he hoped her decision would be. Take whatever time you need. But I should mention that Derek Morrison was arrested last night for violating a restraining order filed by another ex-girlfriend. He's currently in custody, but these charges rarely hold for long. The news should have brought relief, but instead it only emphasized how little protection the legal system could offer against someone determined to cause harm. Derek's pattern of behavior suggested that arrest would only escalate his anger, not diminish it. That evening, Amara sat in her apartment staring at the eviction notice while trying to process the magnitude of Taeyong's offer. $150,000 would solve every financial problem she had ever faced, would give her brother the education he deserved, would allow her to complete her own degree without the constant stress of choosing between rent and food. But accepting the offer would mean entering a world where problems were solved through power rather than law, where protection came with the implicit understanding that violence was always an option. She would be trading her struggling independence for comfortable dependence on a man whose business dealings she could only guess at. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, a photo of him studying in the library with a caption about how grateful he was for her support and how hard he was working to make her proud. The reminder of what her sacrifice was enabling made the decision feel less like choice and more like inevitability. At 2:30 in the morning, the sound of her apartment door being forced open woke her from restless sleep. Through the thin walls, she could hear heavy footsteps moving through her living room, the sound of furniture being overturned and belongings scattered across the floor. Derek's voice drifted through the darkness, slurred with alcohol and thick with rage. I know you're here, Amara. We need to talk about what you owe me, and I'm not just talking about money anymore. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands, her first instinct to call the police, but the reality of her neighborhood meant that response time would be measured in tens of minutes rather than single digits. Derek would have found her long before help arrived, and his current state suggested that this confrontation would be different from his previous harassment. Instead, she found herself scrolling to Taeyong's number, the contact information he had given her for emergencies. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. 12 hours after rejecting his offer of protection, she was about to accept it out of pure desperation. The call connected immediately, as if he had been expecting it. Derek is in my apartment, she whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible as she heard him moving closer to her bedroom. He's drunk and angry, and I think he's going to hurt me. Stay on the line. Taeyong's voice came through the phone with calm authority. Help is already on the way. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of fear and adrenaline. Derek's increasingly violent threats punctuated by the sound of her belongings being destroyed. When he finally tried the bedroom door and found it locked, his pounding against the wood frame made it clear that the flimsy barrier wouldn't hold for long. Then suddenly, there were new voices in her apartment, calm and professional, and Derek's ranting was replaced by the sound of him being forcibly removed from the premises. The relief that washed over her was so profound that she started shaking, the accumulated stress of months of harassment finally finding release. Taeyong arrived shortly after his security team had secured the scene, his presence instantly making her feel safer despite the chaos of her destroyed apartment. He surveyed the damage with the same controlled expression he brought to everything, but she could see the tension in his jaw as he took in the scope of Derek's destructive rage. He won't be coming back, Taeyong said quietly, his tone carrying absolute certainty. When Amara looked into his eyes, she saw something that went beyond professional competence or business efficiency. She saw a man who had just witnessed a threat to someone under his protection, and whose response to that threat would be swift and permanent. "I accept your offer," she said, the words emerging with surprising steadiness. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow," he replied without hesitation. "Pack what you can salvage. Everything else will be replaced." As she stood in the wreckage of her old life, Amara realized that her independence had been an illusion built on hope and determination rather than realistic foundation. Accepting Taeyong's protection meant acknowledging that some battles couldn't be won alone, that survival sometimes required accepting help even when that help came with strings she couldn't fully understand. But watching Derek being led away in restraints, knowing that he would never again be able to corner her in a dark apartment or threaten her brother's safety, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the possibility of peace. 3 months after moving into the Kim estate, Amara had discovered that luxury was not just about expensive furniture and marble countertops, though the estate certainly possessed both in abundance. True luxury, she realized, was the ability to focus completely on work that fulfilled her without the constant anxiety about money that had shadowed her every decision for years. Her suite of rooms in the estate's west wing was larger than her previous apartment, with a sitting area that overlooked the gardens and a bedroom that stayed warm regardless of the weather outside. But the real transformation was in the rhythm of her days, structured around Jiho's needs and progress rather than the frantic juggling of multiple jobs and mounting bills. Jiho himself had become a different child entirely, his confidence growing with each passing week as his world expanded to include new forms of expression and connection. He spoke regularly now, not just to Amara but to his father and the household staff, his vocabulary developing as his comfort with verbal communication increased. This morning, like most mornings, began with their sunrise dance session in the music room. Jiho had requested a routine that incorporated spinning movements, which challenged his balance and spatial awareness while building the kind of body confidence that traditional therapy had never achieved. "I want to show Daddy the spinning dance," Jiho announced as he practiced the controlled turns they had been working on for weeks. "He likes watching us dance together." Taeyong's attendance at their sessions had evolved from concerned supervision to active participation, his expensive suits gradually replaced by comfortable clothes that allowed him to join their movements without constraint. Watching him learn to play with his son, to communicate through movement and music rather than words, had revealed layers to his personality that Amara found increasingly compelling. "Daddy, look," Jiho called out as Taeyong entered the music room, carrying coffee for himself and tea for Amara, a small ritual that had developed over the weeks. "I can spin 6 times without falling down." "That's incredible, son," Taeyong replied, setting the cups aside so he could give Jiho his full attention. "Show me how you learned to do that." As Jiho demonstrated his spinning technique with serious concentration, Amara found herself watching Taeyong's face transform with pride and wonder. The controlled businessman who commanded respect through intimidation became simply a father marveling at his child's accomplishment, and the contrast never failed to make her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "Can you spin too, Daddy?" Jiho asked, reaching for his father's hand with the casual confidence that had taken months to develop. "I can try," Taeyong said, allowing himself to be led into the gentle spinning motion while Amara provided musical accompaniment on the piano. The sight of this powerful man allowing his 8-year-old son to guide him through a dance routine, his expensive watch glinting as he moved with careful coordination, had become one of Amara's favorite moments of each day. There was something profound about witnessing Taeyong's willingness to be vulnerable in front of his child, to prioritize connection over control. After their session, while Jiho worked with his tutor on academic subjects, Amara and Taeyong often shared breakfast on the terrace overlooking the gardens. These conversations had gradually shifted from purely professional discussions about Jiho's progress to more personal exchanges about their respective backgrounds and perspectives on life. "He trusts you completely," Taeyong observed as they watched Jiho practice his letters through the window. "In 3 months, you've given him something I've been trying to provide for years, the confidence to be himself without fear." "You've given him that too," Amara replied sincerely. "He talks about you constantly during our sessions, about how proud he is that his daddy learned to dance, about how safe he feels when you're nearby." "You're a wonderful father," Taeyong. The compliment seemed to affect him more deeply than she had expected, his carefully maintained composure wavering for a moment before he regained control. You don't know how often I've wondered if I was failing him, if my business demands were preventing me from being the parent he needed. The admission revealed a vulnerability that Amara hadn't anticipated, a glimpse into the fears that drove his perfectionist approach to Jiho's care. She found herself wanting to reassure him, to offer the kind of emotional support that went beyond their professional relationship. That evening, after Jiho had gone to bed, Amara was surprised to find Taeyong in the estate's library, a comfortable room lined with books and anchored by a fireplace that cast warm light across leather furniture. He was holding a glass of wine but not drinking it, his attention focused on framed photographs that sat on a side table. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly, suddenly uncertain about whether his presence here was an invitation for company or a desire for solitude. "Not at all," he replied, gesturing toward the chair beside him. "I was just thinking about Jiho's mother." Amara settled into the chair, noticing for the first time that the photographs showed a woman with delicate features and a gentle smile, clearly taken during pregnancy and early motherhood. There was something achingly tender about the way Taeyong held the frame, as if the image were fragile enough to break. "She died when he was born," Taeyong said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of grief that 3 years had not diminished. "Complications during delivery that couldn't be predicted or prevented. One moment we were anticipating our future as a family, and the next I was alone with a newborn who seemed to belong to a world I couldn't understand." The pain in his voice was so raw that Amara felt her own throat tighten with sympathy. She had never heard him speak about his wife, had never even seen these photographs before, and the trust implied in his sharing felt both precious and overwhelming. When the autism diagnosis came 2 years later, I was terrified that I had already failed him, that my inability to understand his needs had somehow caused his struggles. Every meltdown felt like proof that he needed a mother's intuition that I could never provide. Taeyong's hands were steady as he returned the photograph to its place, but Amara could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself as if braced against emotional impact. This was a man who controlled vast business operations through careful planning and decisive action, yet his greatest fear was failing the one person who mattered most to him. "You didn't fail him," she said with quiet conviction. "You sought out every possible resource to help him. You never gave up searching for ways to reach him, and you created an environment where he could feel safe and loved. That's not failure, Taeyong. That's devotion." When he looked at her, his dark eyes held an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how alone they were, how the comfortable familiarity of their daily interactions had gradually shifted into something deeper and more complex. The man sitting beside her was not just her employer or Jiho's father, but someone whose pain and dedication had touched her in ways that went beyond professional respect. "You've given him what I couldn't," he said, his voice lower now, more personal. "You've shown him that the world can be gentle, that his differences are gifts rather than obstacles. Watching you with him, I finally understood what unconditional acceptance looks like." The conversation was interrupted by the sharp sound of the estate's security alarm, followed immediately by Taeyong's phone buzzing with an urgent call. His expression shifted instantly from vulnerable to alert as he answered, his voice taking on the crisp authority Amara recognized from their first meeting. "Someone breached the perimeter fence," he said after ending the call. "3 men with your ex-boyfriend, trying to access the grounds from the east side." The mention of Derek sent ice through Amara's veins, the peace she had found over the past 3 months suddenly threatened by the return of her former nightmare. She had allowed herself to believe that Derek's arrest and the subsequent restraining order would keep him away permanently, but clearly his determination to reclaim control over her life exceeded her optimistic expectations. From upstairs came the sound of Jiho crying, not the typical fussing of a sleepy child, but the kind of distressed sobbing that indicated genuine fear. The security alarm had woken him, and without understanding what was happening, his autism was translating the unfamiliar sounds into overwhelming anxiety. "I need to go to him," Amara said, already moving toward the stairs. In Jiho's bedroom, she found him huddled in his bed with his hands pressed over his ears, his small body shaking with the kind of terror that made her heart ache. The security lights outside his window were flashing in patterns that his sensitive nervous system couldn't process, and the continuing alarm was creating sensory overload that his usual coping mechanisms couldn't handle. "I'm here, sweetheart," she said softly, climbing onto his bed and gathering him into her arms with the gentle confidence born of months of trust building. "Let's breathe together and make the scary feelings smaller." Jiho clung to her with desperate intensity, his face buried against her shoulder as she began the humming routine that always helped him regulate his emotions. Gradually, his breathing began to match hers, and the trembling in his small body started to subside as her presence provided the anchor he needed. When Taeyong appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, his expression was grim but satisfied in a way that suggested Derek's latest attempt had been definitively resolved. However, when he saw Amara holding his son, when he witnessed the complete trust Jiho placed in her comfort and protection, something shifted in his face. "He won't be bothering us again," he said quietly, his words carrying the kind of finality that discouraged further questions. But his attention wasn't focused on the resolution of the external threat. Instead, he was watching the way Jiho had relaxed completely in Amara's embrace, the way his son's face showed peace despite the evening's chaos, and Amara could see recognition dawning in his dark eyes. "You're ours," Taeyong said, his voice rough with emotion that had nothing to do with business arrangements or employment contracts. "Not just as Jiho's therapist, but as part of this family. You belong with us, and I belong to both of you." The declaration hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that transformed every interaction they had shared over the past 3 months. This was no longer about financial security or professional obligation, but about the recognition that they had become essential to each other in ways that couldn't be quantified or negotiated. "And you're mine," Amara replied, the words emerging with startling clarity as she finally acknowledged what her heart had been trying to tell her for weeks. "Both of you. This is where I belong." In her arms, Jiho stirred peacefully, his breathing deep and regular as he slept surrounded by the two people who had become his world. Looking up at Taeyong, Amara saw her own recognition reflected in his eyes. They were no longer 3 separate people sharing a temporary arrangement, but a family bound together by love, trust, and the unbreakable commitment to protect what they had built together. The next 24 hours passed in a strange suspension of normalcy, with Jiho's routine continuing unchanged while Taeyong handled what he referred to simply as business that required his personal attention. Amara found herself torn between curiosity about his methods and relief at being shielded from the details of how threats like Derek were permanently resolved. Taeyong left early that morning wearing the same controlled expression he brought to all serious matters, his expensive suit replaced by darker, more practical clothing that suggested the day's activities would be hands-on rather than administrative. He kissed Jiho goodbye with particular tenderness, as if the boy's innocent trust in his father's ability to solve problems was both precious and heartbreaking. "Keep him close today," he told Amara quietly, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder in a gesture that felt protective and possessive in equal measure. "I'll be back before dinner." The estate's security was more visible than usual, with additional personnel stationed at every entrance and the kind of alert watchfulness that suggested they were prepared for any possibility. But inside the house, Amara worked to maintain Jiho's sense of safety and routine, their morning dance session proceeding as if the previous night's crisis had been nothing more than a bad dream. "Daddy will be home soon, won't he?" Jiho asked during their afternoon session, his intuitive understanding of emotional undercurrents making him more sensitive to changes in atmosphere than most children his age. "Yes, sweetheart," she assured him, spinning him gently through a movement sequence that always made him laugh. "He's taking care of some important business, but he'll be back for dinner just like he promised." The confidence in her voice surprised her, because despite having known Taeyong for only a few months, she trusted his word with absolute certainty. When he said Derek would never bother them again, she believed him not just because of his obvious capabilities, but because of the protective devotion she had witnessed in his interactions with his son. That evening, as the sun began to set over the estate's gardens, Taeyong returned with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had accomplished exactly what he set out to do. He looked tired but not troubled, his expensive suit immaculate despite whatever activities had occupied his day. And when Jiho ran to greet him, his embrace held the relief of a father who could finally guarantee his child's complete safety. "Is the scary man gone forever?" Jiho asked with the direct honesty that autism often produced, his question cutting straight to the heart of what everyone needed to know. "Forever," Taeyong confirmed, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "He will never bother Amara again, and he will never come near our family." The word family fell naturally from his lips, as if the previous night's declarations had settled something that had been uncertain before. Looking at Amara over Jiho's head, his dark eyes held a warmth that transformed his sharp features, and she felt her heart respond with the kind of recognition that couldn't be reasoned away. After dinner, while Jiho played quietly in the living room with building blocks that challenged his fine motor skills, Taeyong asked Amara to join him in the library for what he called an important conversation. The formal request made her pulse quicken with anticipation, though she couldn't predict what new development he might want to discuss. The library felt different tonight, more intimate than institutional, with lamplight creating pools of warmth throughout the book-lined space. Taeyong had prepared tea for both of them, a gesture that spoke to his attention to her preferences and his desire to make this conversation feel significant but not intimidating. "Derek Morrison and his associates are no longer a consideration," he began, settling into the chair beside hers rather than maintaining the distance of formal business discussions. "The threat that brought you into my protection has been permanently resolved." The relief that washed over her was profound, like setting down a weight she had been carrying for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. Derek's capacity for violence and manipulation had been the shadow over every decision she had made for months, and knowing that shadow was gone felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. "But Derek's elimination wasn't the only thing I accomplished today," Taeyong continued, his tone shifting to something more personal. "I also met with my attorneys to discuss making our family arrangement legally permanent." From the inside pocket of his jacket, he produced a small velvet box that made Amara's breath catch in recognition of what it might contain. When he opened it to reveal a ring that was elegant without being ostentatious, clearly expensive but chosen for beauty rather than display, she felt the world tilt slightly around her. "Marry me, Amara," he said, his controlled demeanor softening into something vulnerable and hopeful. "Not because of the arrangement we made or the threats we've faced, but because you and Jiho have become the center of everything that matters to me. I want you to be his mother officially, and I want to be your husband in every way that counts." The proposal was both unexpected and inevitable, the natural progression of feelings that had been building for weeks despite their attempts to maintain professional boundaries. Seeing him with Jiho every day, witnessing his capacity for tenderness alongside his strength, had gradually transformed her respect into something deeper and more permanent. But marriage to Taeyong meant accepting not just his love, but his world, with all the complexities and moral ambiguities that world entailed. The man proposing to her was the same one who had just permanently resolved the Derek situation, whose protection came with methods she couldn't entirely condone even when she benefited from their effectiveness. "I love you," she said, the admission emerging with surprising ease because it was simply the truth. "I love you and I love Jiho, and I can't imagine a life that doesn't include both of you. Yes, I'll marry you." The relief and joy that transformed his face made her realize how much uncertainty he had been carrying despite his confident exterior. For all his power and control, Taeyong had been as vulnerable to rejection as any man asking the woman he loved to share his future. The ring fit perfectly, as if he had somehow determined her size through careful observation, and as he slipped it onto her finger, Amara felt the last of her independence transform into willing partnership with someone who valued her not just for what she could provide, but for who she was. "There are legal documents to be signed," he continued, his voice taking on the practical tone she had learned to associate with his thorough approach to every important matter. "Adoption papers for Jiho, so that you become his legal mother with all the rights and protections that entails. Trust funds established in your name and his. Legitimate business interests that will provide cover for any questions about the source of our wealth." The comprehensive nature of his planning impressed her without surprising her, because this was a man who anticipated every contingency when protecting what he valued. Becoming his wife meant becoming part of an organization that operated by different rules than the conventional world, but it also meant the kind of security that few people ever experienced. From the living room came the sound of Jiho's delighted laughter as he successfully completed a particularly challenging building project, and both adults turned toward the sound with automatic smiles. The boy who had once seemed unreachable had become the heart of their unexpected family, his progress providing the foundation for everything they had built together. "Should we tell him about the wedding?" Amara asked, imagining Jiho's excitement at the prospect of a celebration focused on formalizing the family unit he already understood intuitively. "Tomorrow," Taeyong replied, reaching for her hand with the casual intimacy of a man who no longer needed to question his welcome. "Tonight, I want to enjoy knowing that you're mine officially, that no one can ever question your place in our lives again." The possessive language that might have troubled her months ago now felt like the deepest kind of security, because it was matched by her own sense of belonging to him and to the life they had created together. She was no longer the struggling graduate student counting coins for rent money, but a woman who had found her purpose in healing a special child and loving a complicated man. Later that evening, after Jiho had been tucked into bed with stories about princes and dragons and the promise that tomorrow would bring exciting news, Amara and Taeyong returned to the music room where their story had truly begun. The space felt sacred now, charged with the memory of that first dance when an 8-year-old boy had trusted a stranger enough to take her hand. "Do you remember what you asked him that first day?" Taeyong said, moving to the sound system to select the same gentle instrumental music that had been playing during Jiho's breakthrough moment. "I asked if he wanted to have one dance with me," Amara replied, the memory as clear as if it had happened yesterday rather than months ago. "One dance that changed everything," he said, extending his hand toward her with the same invitation she had once offered his son. "Will you dance with me, Mrs. Kim to be?" As they moved together in the space where Jiho had first learned to trust, where father and son had discovered new ways to communicate, where a family had been born through the simple power of movement and music, Amara felt the completion of a journey she hadn't known she was taking when she first walked into the community center that afternoon. She had entered this world as a woman drowning in debt and fear, her dreams deferred by the constant struggle for survival. She was leaving it as someone who had found not just security but purpose, not just safety but love, not just protection but a future that held infinite possibility. Through the music room's windows, Jiho's nightlight cast a gentle glow that reminded them both of the child sleeping peacefully upstairs, secure in the knowledge that his family was complete and his world was safe. Tomorrow would bring wedding planning and legal documents and the practical arrangements of merging two lives into one shared future. But tonight was for dancing in the space where miracles had first begun, where a simple request for one dance had led to the love that would define the rest of their lives. As Taeyong spun her gently through movements that felt like coming home, Amara knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found the place where she belonged, in the arms of a dangerous man who had proved that sometimes the most powerful protection came wrapped in unexpected tenderness. The music played on, and they danced together in the golden light, three hearts beating in rhythm even though only two bodies moved through the space, because upstairs their son slept peacefully, dreaming perhaps of spinning movements and gentle voices and the absolute security of being loved without condition or reservation.